about social shifts is also a technical skill.
CSR is becoming a very large force of good in this country.
समाज में तो ऐसे ही होता है कि भाई मैं ये कर लेता हूँ, मैं रोटी ले आता हूँ, तू दाल ले आ, सब्जी इस घर से आ जाएगा, and then सब मिलके खाते हैं.
People don't have an understanding of how poverty is solved. What is stopping funders from giving money to the East of India today?
Large parts of the East has its own dhadkan, has its own rhythm.
CSR is actually strengthening the domestic philanthropy landscape in more ways than one. Beyond just being a source of capital, how can CSR influence and solve for some of our pressing social challenges in the country today? To understand and speak about this, we have Sourav Roy, who leads the Tata Steel Foundation with us. Sourav brings a unique perspective of someone who understands the constraints and the boardroom conversations in CSR, at the same time deeply engages with tribal communities to understand what are structural challenges that impede us from solving the problem. Sourav, thank you so much for joining us today. CSR is becoming a very large force of good in this country. Given a large part of Indian philanthropy today is influenced by where corporates are spending money. And one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, as the share of philanthropy money increases from CSR, are we really truly becoming an agent of solving for poverty? Yeah. And that has many layers. And Sourav, I'm so glad you're part of this conversation today because you've had a chance to be at that intersection. You understand how corporates think, work, what their constraints are, but you also understand what it takes to solve for fairly deep-rooted structural challenges in the society. And I would love to have a conversation with you to understand what does it truly take for us to make CSR a force of good.
Thanks, Rathish, for having me on the podcast. I completely agree with you. I think the way resource allocations are going, the way talent allocations have been happening by businesses to try and solve social challenges, I think it's almost been a revolution in the last few years, particularly. But I think it's a very good time to take a pause and just reflect on what are we really solving for? Are we being able to solve for what is most important? Or is it more just a resource allocation question and not really a outcomes or a solution in question? So happy to have this conversation with you.
I want you to spend a little bit time in saying how the CSR thinking has evolved even in the time that you've been in this space, sort of. Where it started maybe as a saying, okay, this is a law, I have to meet it. Let's spend the money, to maybe a place where people are saying, okay, what is the best value that I can create? How have you seen that thinking evolve? And not just from a Tata Steel perspective, but really from an ecosystem, because I know you're connected to a large part of this ecosystem.
When the law came in 2013, 2014, there were clearly, different sets of players who had to grapple with or who had to react to the law. Right? There were some, for whom the subject was not new. Okay, it just converted itself into a mandate. Okay, and then that the implications are largely procedural. Not so much at a fundamental level, let's put it that way. And there were also businesses who had to grapple with it for the first time in a concerted manner. The biggest difference that the mandate has made, like I've always maintained, is that it's made it a board level agenda.
Absolutely.
It's creating that place at the table. Has been seminal for the challenge, because I've always found that I think historically that's been the trend, right? If there's if there's something that comes up as a straw in the wind and then sort of becomes a mega trend and then becomes a mandate, businesses have responded and found a way to do the right thing and do it the right way. In the last few years, the first initial phases were obviously for the sector was of making it a board level agenda, therefore gently talent allocation becoming better, resource allocations being a question first and then being subjected to the right questions, right? So it's evolved, but having said that, I think it's brought in significant amount of capital, and I also think it's made the domestic impact sector much more resilient.
100%.
There's greater capital, there's stuff that you can fall back on.
Yeah, because you said a lot of things. I want to reflect on a few, and then I have a question. One is this resilience of a domestic sector. A lot of times people don't understand how important that is. Like I was in Nepal before the earthquake. I remember that the biggest vehicles were driven by the people who had the biggest funding in this space.
That's true.
And even if you travel across Asia today, you will realize that there are countries where philanthropy money comes in with a mandate, with exactly the norms, and then tells you what has to be done. this idea of we will define the agenda of our country in a certain form is actually a trend for the last 10-15 years, and I remember at one point I had this graph which said, well, who are the largest NGOs in India 20 years ago and who are the largest NGOs in India now, and you feel like how many Indian NGOs are now in the top 10 list. It's actually a lot, and that is a very important shift, that we can in some sense mobilize the capital and determine how we want to work while being open to money coming into India as equals, rather than having that skewed relationship in some form, and having that voice and proximity to the problem, I think is a very, very important piece. I don't know if you agree with that.
No, I completely agree with that. I mean, the easiest and the most intuitive way of doing this is what would have happened if this capital wouldn't have been there. I mean,
counterfactual. Yeah.
Just the counterfactual sort of proves the point, right? That this capital exists. It can be directed better.
Yeah.
It can be more effective, but that is always going to be true.
Correct.
Always going to be true. Also, because sometimes it's not a function of the capital. It's also a function of the fact that when I speak to many people in the space, there's a lovely articulation जैसे कि सेक्टर बन रहा है. ये सेक्टर क्या होगा, सेक्टर कैसा होगा नहीं पता, पर अभी सेक्टर बन रहा है.
Right.
So I think it's important for us to take a look at it from that, who the participants are, what the various roles are. I think we are navigating a fascinating phase for I don't know if there's industry 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, maybe it's, I don't know, social sector 1.0 is getting built or 2.0 is getting built.
Correct.
It's fascinating if you look at it that way.
Absolutely. The other point that you made, which I deeply resonate with, is that the idea that you make it a board level conversation. Sometimes it's not about where you land it, but it's a set up an engine that will get progressively better. And I tell this to everybody I talk to, saying, it's not like a board member is going to be very smart for 90 minutes of the conversation. The last 50 minutes are going to get very dumb. So they apply the same intellectual rigor, the same sort of ambition to conversations on CSR as well. And I have personally seen how that's clicked off of a flywheel where companies are starting asking more questions. But I think the word I wanted to pick up in that is that word technical. Because in the previous podcast episode we had also, I often see that people don't have an understanding of how poverty is solved. And I do believe that in some cases, people have this view that poverty is solved through a pipe. यहाँ पे पैसा डालो, that money will go down to the poor and the poor get better. And they think of everything else in this pipe as transmission loss. अगर पैसा बाहर जा रहा है, तो it's transmission loss. तो मैंने 100 रुपये दिया, तो 99 has to go to the poor person. This technical understanding of what does it truly take is not even an articulation that people have. And I also don't think non-profits often articulate very clearly to people. This is the engine that it takes to solve the problem that we are solving. Can you unpack that? Like, what is this technical element of solving for poverty?
The accountabilities of a business is a reality.
Yeah.
And real change and the complexity and the dirt is also a reality. So like I said, while it is on the board agenda, the biggest challenge on the shoulders of people like us is to navigate both the realities without being dishonest to either.
Correct.
Because both are realities. Okay. To go back to that, transmission leakage, analogy that you gave. The first thing is to understand poverty in its entirety. To know to map out what the dimensions are. Okay. I mean, simple things, right? I mean, if you look at educational non-attainment, बच्चा स्कूल नहीं जा रहा है या बच्ची स्कूल नहीं जा रही है, ठीक है, वो उसके कितने कारण हो सकते हैं, ठीक है. अगर आपका यूनिट ऑफ एनालिसिस ठीक से फ्रेम्ड है कि हर बच्चे को स्कूल में ले जाना है, यूनिट ऑफ एनालिसिस स्कूल है या यूनिट ऑफ एनालिसिस बच्चा है. अगर यूनिट ऑफ एनालिसिस बच्चा है, देन यू विल डू व्हाटएवर इट टेक्स टू गेट द चाइल्ड बैक टू स्कूल. अगर यूनिट ऑफ एनालिसिस स्कूल है, फिर एनरोलमेंट रेशियो देखेंगे आप, ठीक है. So it is intuitively knowing that if change has to happen, then if that's instead of the pipe, if you just make it a lever, and that the pressure has to be here, this is where the fulcrum is, and that is the technicality. Simple thing, right? We look at the sector, we design our sectoral approaches in themes, but we don't live our lives in themes.
Of course.
हम themes में जिंदगी नहीं जीते हैं कि आज मंगलवार है, आज हम लोग शिक्षा पे काम करते हैं, कल हम लोग स्वास्थ्य पे काम करेंगे, ऐसा नहीं होता है.
Correct.
So that's about it, yeah. And I think it's on people like us who should be able to push ourselves, to articulate both realities better. I think the magic happens when there's transparent dialogue. That is also a technical skill. Do you have the ability to, sit amongst communities and actually break down the reality of a business?
Right.
And do you have the ability to sit in the boardroom and communicate the reality of communities. This chain breaks at our level.
Yeah.
This chain doesn't break anywhere else. And that's why I think, some of us who have this space are critical to what this space might mean going forward.
One is the use of the word lever and not a pipe. I think you just take the same line and make it something as a lever. And that's a very important distinction, right? Because when you go to a community, I feel like people end up in one of the two ends. Either they get overawed by the fact that यार भाई caste भी है, language भी है, gender भी है, education भी है, poverty भी है, कहाँ पे solve करना है. Then they get caught in analysis paralysis, or they get like very narrow focused and say मेरा problem education है, बाकी सब जाए बाढ़ में. I'm just going to focus on this. But the idea of the lever is to say, hey, these are interconnected problems, but what is the place I have to put the pressure that will give us these cascading impacts to solve for other problems? And can we start from there? And that lever doesn't always remain the same point. Once you fix for it, you might get another point, etc. But understanding that idea of leverage is very important. And oftentimes I feel we make decisions on where to apply pressure before we go to the community.
So, Rathish, there are many realities at play here. Right? I think one is, let's say there's an organization in the sector who's choosing to solve only for learning outcomes in the classroom.
Correct.
Okay. I would not write that off, because there are resource realities, there are many constraints that you can do. And, there are also some lovely organizations who say that, hey, listen, the thought process is very interesting, saying, this is something that I can do very well. This is something that I can do brilliantly. The others, I don't know what to do. Okay, so let me just do this. Now that thought process you can't discount. That's a fair thought process in my mind. I'm just saying that I think there's a lot of conversation around convergence. There's a lot of conversation around collaboration in the space. I think if that lever analogy that we were talking about, if we say that समाज में तो ऐसे ही होता है कि भाई मैं ये कर लेता हूँ, मैं रोटी ले आता हूँ, तू दाल ले आ, सब्जी इस घर से आ जाएगा, एंड देन सब मिलके खाते हैं. जिस घर से खाना आया सिर्फ वो नहीं खा रहे, बाकी और भी घर खा रहे हैं, सब बिल्कुल समुदाय खा रहा है, राइट. सो आई थिंक इफ वी, टू माय माइंड, सॉल्विंग फॉर वन एस्पेक्ट is not a problem. I don't think we should or can, or I think it will be unfair to write off programs and do that. I just think that if there's if that convergence can happen, saying that if I am solving for learning outcomes in the same geography, can you just solve for nutrition, please? Correct. Can you solve for gender and attitudes? Correct. And then see where we go. That's another emerging trend, and I think it's something that we've sort of embedded in our programs a while ago, looking at geography, looking at the spatial or the geographic element of, where your work is situated. One aspect of looking at space or geography is obviously to look at it as, as blocks, districts, panchayats, urban local bodies, as the case might be, which is the conventional definition. We've also found that when communities think of their problems, they have a very different aspect of geography. ठीक है, एक नदी भी एक geography है.
Right.
Okay? एक बच्चा जब स्कूल छोड़ के या घर छोड़ के भागता है, उसके लिए वो रेलवे ट्रैक एक geography है. If we are able to introduce a little more complexity and a little more conversation in how we select where we situate our programs, I think that's going to solve for a lot. That again is a technical skill, right?
Correct.
How do you have the ability of looking at it's like customer centricity, in a manner of speaking, right? If you have community centricity, you will know what the dynamics are, what the rhythms are.
You talked about getting this reality understood in the boardroom and talking about the technical capability. One of the challenges I feel, Sourav, is the lack of vocabulary in that we use, that the community uses and that a boardroom uses is so different. And hence, the tacit intelligence. I was watching the show called Modern Family, where a Spanish lady is married to the Colombian lady is married to the English guy, and she says, I sound very stupid every time I speak in English, right? And the guy speaks to her in Spanish, and like, I'm so glad you are the stupid one right now. And that is so true in community context, that they are very smart in their vocabulary and context. But when they speak about their problems in our language, we almost always assume that that is not the case. The question is, how do we translate that intelligence to people who are making decisions on impact and impact capital today?
We also did a very interesting exercise on, as part of the wider Tata Steel ecosystem, called future back thinking, where we actually said that let's not get burdened by mega trends. Let's place ourselves maybe 20 years hence and see that, what should the world look like, and then sort of think back, saying that, okay, if that's where we have to get to, how do we sort of build for what needs to be done? One of the impact pathways that came out of that exercise, which we have adopted in the foundation, is how do you embed a societal perspective in business decisions. Okay, one of the things that we've introduced is a program called Unurum. Unurum, Rathish, in several tribal languages, refers to a conversation where if you and I are having a conversation, then both of us leave with a deeper sense of each other.
Wow.
Okay, so it's not a trivial conversation. It's not a this thing. There are other words. There's a word called uprum for adda or a trivial conversation. Unurum is a specific word where. So we use that to design. I'm going to use the word immersion, but it's not just any other immersion. Where if you have a certain challenge, if you have a certain thought process, if let's say you're looking at design thinking, but for some reason you're feeling that certain communities are not sort of stepping up on design thinking, then we've helped other organizations there to say that, why don't you come here and figure out what the design thinking rhythm is. Maybe people are not stepping up because there is a very strong design thinking element already. So, unless you sort of factor that in, it's not going to happen. So how does gender work? How does gender work without the guardrails of an organization? And therefore can organizations learn from how women are navigating everyday lives without the guardrails of an organization, but purely basis their rights as a citizen,
right,
and sort of come back and strengthen their own processes to do that. We look at the role of a sarpanch as one of the most multidimensionally complex roles, and what are the management principles that get applied there to come back and look at how management can happen better. So we use all these learnings to actually teach in business schools. I think we're teaching in about 7 business schools, courses on strategy, courses on operations, where we're trying to see that businesses can learn from social contexts. The reason I'm referring to this is because, to go back to the question that you asked, I see many organizations being led or navigated by people who are very keen to learn this. Okay, and that is extremely heartening. Who are very keen to understand. There is a emotional value to it, but it triggers a certain sentiment, it triggers a certain emotion. Second is, it also makes you alert to the fact that there is an alternate intelligence framework that exists outside,
right,
which you may not be plugged into. And then it comes back to say that you have your process network. Don't step out of your processes network or your this thing, but accommodate that that sentiment and that alternate intelligence network into what you're doing.
Right.
Make space for that. And that has worked beautifully.
As two of us who are working in the system to step out and say, are we setting up the system to drive the behaviors we want to drive? I don't think we've set up the system for the behaviors we want to drive. And I want to maybe unpack why that has been the case, right? And I have a couple of hypotheses. I want to play that out, and you tell me which of them are true, right? I think one part of it is the commitment to the problem that we are solving at a fundamental level.
Sure.
Saying, which problem are we solving? Like if I'm solving a problem of industrial license to operate, I'm solving it differently.
Sure.
Second, there is a question on the quality of people that we are applying to solving this problem. Like what you talked about on room is a certain level of skill to understand a context, synthesize the learning, and make it relevant to another context in which people appreciate it. That's a very complex skill. That's the quality of talent we have today to be able to do this work the right place. I think that's the second question. I think the third question is the engagement at the level of the way we understand this reality through the metrics that we apply, the numbers that we synthesize this to, reflect the nuances of the reality that we are talking to. Because at some point, all of this becomes a number. And if the numbers tell a certain story, the measurement defines how we manage in some sense as well. And lastly, I think is the definition of aspiration and success. Which is what are we aiming this engine towards in some form. All of these are why people are responding a certain way to this system. If you step back and if I had to ask you, which of these or which among these are relevant to shifting the needle for this to not become a 5% conversation but a 95% conversation in this system, what would you sort of think is the case?
Two things that would make this a 100% conversation from the 5 to 10% conversation that you're talking about. One is recognizing that there's a third vocabulary beyond just the business vocabulary and the community vocabulary, which is the vocabulary, I don't have a name for it, but let's just call it the evidence vocabulary or the bridge vocabulary, right? Which it so turns out that it has its own, it has its own life, it has its own lexicon, which is what some of us might call evaluation, some of us might call evidence, some of us might call it theory of change. So there are different terms to that. But there has to be a shared understanding, that's one. Okay, and the second, again I go back to what I'm saying, is recognizing that making social shifts is a technical skill. Then the question that most companies face is that if it's a technical skill, then where is it housed? Right? Where does this talent rest? This talent either rests with you if you are choosing to be an implementing organization, or it rests with your partners, right? Or your implementing partners. So what kind of emphasis are you giving on, making sure that this talent is recognized, this talent is altered, and this talent has this talent and this perspective has a place at the table. And the other piece is a shared bridge vocabulary. I think that's where things tend to go a little south.
Yeah.
Okay.
And maybe we build on that, right? So, and let's take those two very, very clear pillars.
Sure.
Let's say I am a CSR leader. I am committed to a particular geography for the next 20 years. My plants are there, my communities are there, etc. Today, and what you're calling the bridge vocabulary is what I call the social sector vocabulary, by the way. The social sector vocabulary is we create a certain language as interlocutors between the two parts. How should an ideal social sector vocabulary then look like? And if I'm, like I said, if I'm the CSR manager, how do I sort of, what should we remove, what should we nuance for this to actually become 100%?
Let me divide this vocabulary into three parts. Okay. One is how clued in are we and how strongly are we able to evidence, first to ourselves and then to our boards or to the sector, the fact that there could be a perspective that is different from our perspective.
Correct.
Okay, so that's fundamental. That's number one. Second is, are we able to demonstrate or evidence that what we are solving for is relevant, is a core development challenge, right? And third is the simple one of, are we able to evidence progress and what our goals are and all of that. So the first one, let me give you an example of the first one.
Yes, please.
Okay. I told you that we did a future back thinking exercise. There was a lovely question that one of my colleagues asked. It said something very simple. He said, ये हम तो कर रहे हैं future back exercise, ये समाज में कौन future back exercise करता है? तो ये तो appropriation हो गया. So that high quality talent which has the ability to articulate and which has the ability to articulate and also bring in a community voice will always end up asking you difficult questions.
Yes.
And that's the loveliness of it. So we went out to about a little more than 3,000 individuals. Okay, these were individuals who were in difficult circumstances by all conventional logic. Okay, within urban slums, and there are people who at least someone on our team knew. Okay, and we went to them with with just one question. 10 साल में दुनिया को कहाँ देखते हैं? कोई क्वेश्चनर नहीं, कोई सर्वे नहीं, कोई नीड्स असेसमेंट नहीं, हम ओपिनियन मांग रहे थे. ठीक है, तो ये जो 3,000 के आसपास लोग थे, अबाउट 52% रिमेन साइलेंट. These are half an hour conversation like you and I are having. It was a one-on-one conversation. It's not a stranger coming in. It's someone who's been working with you. Then there were some who said, I don't know, I don't care. Some who had a point of view. That. Conventional logic, how would these 51% be treated? They would be, possibly, they would be invalid responses. That's where marginalization happens, no?
Correct.
If you're not able to articulate in a conversation like you and me in a safe context, how do you deal with that? So just the fact that 51% weren't even able to articulate कि 10 साल में दुनिया कहाँ जाने वाली है, to me it's valuable information. These are not invalid responses. We cannot write them off. So the question then, as on people like us, say that if this pie chart comes to you, okay, say 10%, 20%, 51%, no response. It's not no response. In a safe circumstance, people aren't able to conceptualize. That's where conventional paradigms need to be challenged, where evidence needs to be looked at differently. And this kind of evidence, now whenever we present strategy or whenever we present this thing, when we start speaking about this, even in the Unurums and even in our own discussions, we actually say that, by the way, this is our decadal plan and this is what we are trying to do. Having said that, we are also thinking on behalf of people who, if we want to work with a cohort who, it's not that they can't, it's just that there are so many layers that they have to get through. Do we look at evidence like this to establish that there are different perspectives? Okay, or do we just have a conversation on this and say that there's a different perspective, है अलग है, सोच का ढंग अलग है, ये अलग है, हाँ कुछ तो करना चाहिए, फिर वो बोल के हम लोग आगे निकल गए. So the second level is, just evidence which is, which looks at, are we really solving for what is core, which is where, what is your theory on change, on poverty? Most of your conversations need assessments.
Yeah. That example of no answer being an option, right? And I have done enough surveys where I would have assumed that that's an exception or a bug, not a feature. And even being able to recognize creation of these options from the community upwards rather than downwards, I think is very, very critical, because if we are not able to listen to the nuance, what can we even create as a value? And the second is the process of co-creation.
That's right.
How do we be able to truly co-create? And I think, like you rightly said, every need assessment is not a conversation, right? Like, so you go and then there's also a huge...
And every conversation is not a
need assessment also. What sort of skills and capabilities do we really need to build in the CSR manager cadre, who are essentially then responsible for a large amount of population and people today?
What we did, I think, in the last 6 months was, in some of the panchayats where we work in Odisha, we reconstructed the MDP from scratch, going to every household in the panchayat.
Wow.
Okay, saying that let's see how this goes. I can't tell you how instructive the exercise was. Please understand, this is not a needs assessment. There are many elements of in the three aspects or the 3 points of deprivation of the MDP. There are several we may not be working on, but you just start having these conversations. Went to each and every household. Our teams went and did it. Our teams also went and did it because, dialogue, right?
Yeah.
It's a dialogue. This is how you create those forums. And we reconstructed the MDP. Okay. Now for these panchayats, we realize that, there are points of deprivation, okay, which may need more attention from our side. It may not need more resource allocation. That's the thing. One of the points of deprivation is around the usage of cooking fuel, for instance. Now, there is a behavior change element in that. So addressing some things may not actually need financial resources. You could figure out programs. There's also a very strong trend on volunteering that's coming across companies right now. I mean, you can have people who may not be from the CSR teams and are actually creating an impact. And if CSR teams within the organizations are able to create a meaningful path of purpose, for instance, for colleagues, and harness the wider talent set within companies to actually influence poverty outcomes or social outcomes. Just imagine what it would mean for the morale of the organization, what it would mean for a sense of meaning, purpose for the organization. Is it easy? It's not easy. So the reason I'm giving you the example is this combines, one is the first pillar. How strongly are you doing perspective evidence and context evidence?
Absolutely.
You have the ability to reconstruct. Most of these are available at a district level. Some are available at a block level. I think NFHS information has a greater penetration than, let's say, MDP penetration information at this stage. These are available without paywalls. Just reconstruct it. You will need a little bit of statistical understanding. You will need a little bit of contextual understanding.
But do we have this quality of talent in the space?
If I'm a little provocative, how does it matter if it's not 100% accurate? Sometimes the process is more important than the result.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
I mean, if you look at it, if I were a small to medium sized company who was trying to look at creating this thing, and let's say I was in a peri-urban area, and to my mind, what a beautiful challenge to have, not just for the CSR team, but build a team which says, just go and have these conversations. किसी के घर जाके चाय पीजिए, किसी के घर जाके थोड़ा बैठ के बात कीजिए, ठीक है? ये क्वेश्चनर के बेसिस पे आप MDP इस्लाम के लिए रिकंस्ट्रक्ट कीजिए. Talent outside the CSR team in companies is a legitimate resource for social impact.
Correct.
And that perspective is for social impact organizations like ourselves, CSR team like ourselves, is for us to take, and I think that'll pan out.
One related question here, Sourav, is also is the absorption capacity or the role of non-profits in these spaces. We are also talking about spaces that are harder and the capabilities that the non-profits bring. Like one of the provocative views that we have at Sattva is that it's not a capital availability problem, it's a capital absorption problem. How much money can non-profits actually take? How can they be partners? And increasingly we are seeing corporate foundations actually becoming implementation organizations also, because now they're saying, hey, I have the capital and I also want to bring in that muscle and so on as well. In your experience of working with players today, where do you see the challenge?
The way I look at it, I think the largest share of capital in CSR is in the first category, where people are choosing to be funders or grant makers, with some strong overlap with the second category of running institutions, and then there are some who run institutions very strongly. There are a very limited set of people who are going into ground implementation, online implementation. So today when people say that we are implementers, it's important to ask the question that are you the institutional implementers or are you on-ground implementers? And again, like I said, without value judging any choice, it's an operating model choice. And I think as companies jump onto this bandwagon or deepen their expertise in CSR, I think this is a board level conversation that needs to happen. Saying that what is your operating model? I don't think there's any. The operating model, by the way, itself is a theory of change. Can 100%. Be a theory of change.
100%.
And I've seen some of the leading thinkers in the sector recognize this as a theory of change. For us, sorry, to go back to your original question on, I still think that in terms of capabilities, funding grant making lies closest to a business's capability, inherent natural capability as a system, right? And this ground implementation is the farthest away from the natural capability of a business. And therefore, I think it comes with different complexities, unfamiliar terrains, metrics of success, to go back to the evidence, which are very different from, here efficiency of fund flow, effectiveness, these are slightly easier to define. Here, you're doing something different. There is significant capacity, but I think the absorption capacity of this piece, if people who are choosing to be funders and donors, I think if they set aside some element of capital on, say funding true cost, looking at organizational development, and that's a very real conversation in the sector. That like you said, I mean, there's program funding, but there may not be enough OT funding. There may not be enough, funding available for doing all the important organizational work that vests within in between programs.
We talked about the East, Sourav, and one of the things that I wanted to ask you is that despite the fact that we know there is greater challenges in the East, the flow of capital to East of India is still been much lower, right? We talked about multidimensional poverty. If you look at the number of aspirational districts and blocks, if you look at any metric, the flow of capital should ideally be more. What do you think is constraining the capital? One, and some of it we've already spoken about. One is there is a lack of understanding of the challenges. Second is just the awareness of who to give is missing. But from your vantage point, what is stopping funders from giving money to the East of India today?
100% of the conversation was around a need that is there in the eastern part of the country. There has to be a similar conversation on the potential of the East.
Correct.
And for us, because we were there, we saw massive where others saw absence of basics. We saw absence of basics plus potential to do wonders. And also large parts of East has its own dhadkan, has its own rhythm.
Right.
More than organizations, there aren't enough models that have emanated which are East specific. Also, a lot of the need conversation around East, centers around conventional social challenges. There is very little conversation around the climactic vulnerability of the East. So to my mind, if there's ecological capital or there's capital around nature-based solutions, around biodiversity that should get allocated, I think because that is a set of capital that is getting created now, right? That should also look at the East as, there are many places which are at risk. Correct. But vulnerability is the highest in the East.
And I'm a huge believer in the fact that entrepreneurs unlock value.
Yes.
Capital follow entrepreneurs, right?
That's true.
Do we need a lot more focus on just rooted entrepreneurs who can build that Jharkhand education model, Bihar education model, etc. From that context and not
absolutely.
sort of jump from it. And do you see enough focus on that happening today?
I see that focus coming on now in a Jharkhand and in Odisha, where there is a very strong entrepreneurial ecosystem which is rooted from where individuals are. And finding expression, through incubation channels, through setting up their own enterprises. Number of youngsters who we see are who are setting up businesses that are emanating out of Jharkhand, emanating out of Odisha, or number of youngsters who are wanting to do something.
Correct.
Has significantly gone up, and credit to the entire ecosystem for getting that done. See, the other big shift in the last few years is that information is now available very democratically, right? So I think you use the word aspirational, challenges. I think aspirations are through the roof, and in a space where there are many who who have the risk appetite, so to say, within their personal risk appetite, to say, listen, we'll do what I want to do. We also see a lovely trend of the diaspora of the East coming back to the East to set up in East and work in the East.
Correct.
These are systemically, these are lovely trends to have. The best minds, the best doers are coming back and saying that I want to build here.
Right.
I don't want to build anywhere else.
Right.
And the moment things like that start happening, those are your, to go back to that evidence matrix, right? I mean, those are your early evidences of things that are happening. And I think the difference that I see of is ultimately entrepreneurship is a very advanced form of self-expression, right?
Yeah. I feel like there is a place, and I'm taking it as an example, like Maharashtra, and some parts of Maharashtra, where it is easy for capital to flow. And so a lot of people will continue to invest in that. Karnataka, some parts of Karnataka is true for that. But there are some places like these, like you said, where fundamental investments have to happen, which will take time.
That's true.
And those investments will create a level playing field where over a period of time you will sort of change the differences. As you're looking at the conversations you're having with CSR leaders and other philanthropy, not just CSR, right? Who are saying, hey, listen, I want to create a more level playing field. And to go back to the question that we asked, saying, are we truly solving the problems? What are some characteristics or traits that they have to sort of embellish? Because today, just building on what you said, if I tell them that aapko identity mein kaam karna hai, so most CSRs are going to be like, yaar, to kaam kya karenge hum? Right? That imagination is not there. I'm using this as an opportunity to say, hey, if you're really truly solving for poverty, there are long-term investments that have to happen in these places through organizations that are already working in this. How would that look like? What is your sort of aspirational postcard for people like that who want to say, mujhe yahan pe karna hai?
These are the kind of conversations which maybe there's a case to say that, hey, listen, it can be a competitive fund allocation process, but at least for the next 5 years, we are going to introduce a priority. Because if you're building on an advanced base, you're going to get to success sooner, and therefore it's deceptive because you're forgetting this base, but you're only looking at that, right? So that's number one. Number two, personally, if a business is operating somewhere, I think it's important for the business to make sure that the neighborhood is in order.
Right.
There's no running away from that. But if you don't have a defined neighborhood, I think that capital has to go where the country needs it the most. Okay, and today, whether it's the aspirational frameworks, whether it's the MDP information, whether it's state level frameworks, district level information, I think this budget also spoke about regional allocations, regions as a definition. I think it's just for people to wake up and look at what needs to be done, doing the right thing in a place where no one else is actually doing it. I think that trust is underrated as a business outcome.
Yeah.
And to my mind, trust gets built where there is no quid pro quo.
Yeah.
If there is a quid pro quo, trust doesn't get built. That's what communities have taught us. That's what Tata and Tata Steel has taught me, taught our teams. So therefore, the question is, if you go there and you create social impact where you have no business creating social impact, and people actually asked a very simple question कि आप यहाँ पे क्यों काम कर रहे हैं और इतनी शिद्दत से क्यों काम कर रहे हैं, वो भरोसा अगर आपके बिजनेस को आ गया ना, I mean, it's worth its weight in gold.
Absolutely.
Trust, pure trust. Because today, the biggest issue is trust deficit, right?
Yeah.
I think if you start building that, I mean, that's a business return that doesn't get quantified, but it needs to get spoken about.
One of the recurrent themes in our conversation, sort of, right from the Unurum example to what we talked about now, is the quality of the CSR leaders that we need, And I think that it's an evolving space. But throughout our conversations, we talked about the technical nature of impact. We talked about where this is going. As you envision the future roadmap for CSR leaders to build their capability, not for the ones that are here today, but for the ones that are seeing this as a career in the future, what are some areas that they have to double down on for them to be effective and actually drive for national development?
CSR as a space, okay, is possibly amongst the most underrated within businesses in terms of the complexity it has to handle if it has to work correctly.
Correct.
Okay, that's where we should begin with, because if you have a CSR manager, okay, the CSR manager is supposed to have a grip on what communities are talking about, have a sense of what that, what is the intangible sense, finger on the pulse of communities. That's one expectation.
Right.
Expectation is to be a damn good program manager. Okay, be on top of evidence, be on top of program design, structure. To have a segue into finance and funding, to understand how funds are flowing, be accountable to audits, etc. Have a network amongst peers. Okay, be a multi-thematic expert, if not a single thematic expert.
Right.
On top of that, there's an understanding on the fact that as ecological, carbon, energy, water narratives evolve, embed that into CSR programs.
Correct.
Okay, so इतना तो multidimensional role है.
Bilkul. So when you say it like that, you see the complexity. Yeah.
Correct. And this is ideally for a set of stakeholders. For every business, there is a set of stakeholders who are bound by a certain quid pro quo equation. This is also for a set of stakeholders who are not bound to a business by quid pro quo. This thing. I mean, there's a transaction between shareholders and investors in the business. There's a transaction between these things. So even if, to my mind, businesses are multi-stakeholder enterprises.
Of course.
All stakeholders are important for a business. But this set of people have to work with a set of stakeholders who are not bound may not be bound by an institutional affiliation. You have to build something as intangible as social capital, demonstrate impact, be damn good at your job, and this is. So ये तो role की complexity है.
बिल्कुल.
ठीक है. Because the current generation which is coming into businesses, okay, maybe because of the various stimuli around them, I mean, days are getting hotter, inequities are perpetuating themselves, whatever it is. I think there's a much greater consciousness and need to do good.
Yeah.
I mean, in all our teaching in business schools, I see that in spade loads in a Tata Steel or a Tata Steel Foundation. At that possible age, between the ages of 20 to 30, just the need to do the right thing, or a sense of purpose has multiplied. Okay, the skills to support that intent have not multiplied. They haven't seeped into academia yet.
Right.
So therefore, if you don't want to do good and you don't have the skills, no one bothers. You're not frustrated. You want to do good, but every time you take 2 steps and you get stuck somewhere, then you're frustrated.
Correct. I feel like when we talk about the nation solving for the country agenda, one way is to think about individual companies doing this. The other is to see how can collaboration happen. And I know how collaboration gets beaten up in every conversation because intent तो बहुत है, मगर करना बहुत मुश्किल है. And especially with the corporate space, I feel, and some to framing we started earlier, Sourav, I feel like there are companies that are going to double down on places, locations, communities very deeply.
True.
And there are companies that are going to say, I'm going to be really good at skill development, I'm going to be very good at education, etc. That's my moat. Right? Today, the marriage between these two ambitions is still very forced. Like the companies that are saying, मुझे 1 लाख jobs create करने में India, pan India, are not talking to the people who are sitting in communities today. And I feel like maybe it's an incentive problem, maybe it's just a discovery problem. A, do you feel like that is going to happen? And 2, what does it take for that to happen effectively?
So Rathish, I am an eternal optimist on this. Okay, I think, I mean, one has to converge, one has to collaborate in the space if you have to build for the kind of scale and complexity that India deserves.
Correct.
And India needs at this stage. I will also add another dimension to this. I think it also brings in a certain amount of, scrutiny or transparency in your process, because ultimately if you are converging like-minded partners, your own work is getting better.
Correct.
As long as that exists. To me, first, it's a discovery problem. I think, but I see that becoming lesser and lesser of a challenge, because I think people are also beginning to discover with greater rapidity that we can't solve this alone. The challenge right now is to structure these collaboratives. You know, how are we hitting upon the right structure? Are we sort of, the incentive challenge that you said. I think if there's a situation or a circumstance where I think all partners bring in complementary skill sets and complementary perspectives and have the sort of, ability to have that discussion, have that this thing, and then walk that path.
Correct.
I think it's certainly a possibility.
Saurav, it's been a far-ranging conversation. I think we've taken a whole bunch of things. Thank you so much for patiently answering all the questions and keeping it so engaging. And honestly, for me, it's not often that we get the voice of the community in the level of nuance that you shared today. So I'm very grateful that you were part of this conversation.
Oh, thank you, Rathish. Thanks for having me on the podcast. We learn from our communities, and I learn from this outstanding team that I work with. I stand on the shoulders of giants, and I walk with people who will be giants tomorrow. So that way. But thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.